And therefore, I welcome on the panel Nancy Duxbury. And I think, Nancy, if you maybe unmute yourself for a second, we can pin your video. Perfect, perfect. So Paul, our technical moderator, has everything under control. Welcome, Nancy. Nancy is a senior researcher at the Center for Social Studies at the University of Coimbra in Portugal and a member of the European Expert Network on Culture. Welcome, Nancy.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
And second on our panel is Fernando García-Dory. He is an artist and sociologist and an agro-ecologist. His work engages specifically with relationships between culture and nature. Welcome, Fernando. If you unmute, go on unmute, and we can see a video, then Paul can pin your video and we get all of you connected on the panel. Fernando, are you there?
Hi, yes, I'm here. Just a second.
Perfect. Just woke up. No, I know you've been there because we wrote messages to each other before. So happy to have you, and Paul can pin your video so the four of us can be seen by everyone. And then we have Benjamin Jørgensen. You just met him. He's a professor of education with a focus on culture and aesthetics at the Friedrich Alexander University Erlangen, Nuremberg, my alma mater, by the way. And he holds the UNESCO chair in arts and culture in education. Welcome, Benjamin, on the panel.
Thank you.
Great to have the four of you now together. To the participants, if you have questions to the panelists, please write them in the chat, and at the end of our discussion, we will try to sort them and hand them over to our panelists. So let's kick off. In this upcoming hour, I'd like to focus on three major challenges of our days: globalization, the COVID-19 pandemic, and the climate crisis are having their effects primarily outside the large cities. And these major transformational processes have a massive impact on arts and culture education practice in rural area, as we also discussed this morning and in the workshops. So glocalization, please, Nancy, can you explain what that term means to you, and also how you address the tensions between the local and the global through your research?
Okay, thank you. We just heard a definition of glocalization, which I also was here to, but I think when I think about glocalization as a term, I guess from the local perspective, and I think of how global flows of ideas and people and materials are appropriated and taken up in different ways by a local community, and how the specificities of a local place can have global impact, potential global influence through being an example for other places, of most of which you will have never anticipated to influence, but it happens in today's world. So I think that's enough for that one. You want me to continue? Okay.
No, it's fine, Nancy. Yeah, that's perfect. A brief explanation of the term, and maybe Benjamin, you want to add what localization means to you. Is it quite the same of what Nancy said, or do you like to add up?
Yeah, well, I'm quite fine with this definition. I would just like to add that I think there are two basic understandings of terms like this. So the one is descriptive. So we see that every process of globalization has to happen somewhere, and does happen at many places at the same time. And of course, it gets its own forms and colors, so to say. And on the other hand, we could understand glocalization as a program, so to say, as something that we would try to strengthen and to foster in order as a counter concept, so to say, to globalization, meaning that globalization would be more a top-down process, and glocalization could be understood more as a bottom-up process. So there would be a political, in the broader sense, a political program tied to that, or maybe an educational program also. I think this is interesting to understand glocalization as such, as a counter concept also a bit.
Right, thank you. As a bottom-up concept. And Fernando, you studied fine arts and rural sociology. And as an artist, what are your creative techniques to address glocalization through your work? Because I know it's also kind of bottom-up that links to what Benjamin said.
Yes, thank you, Eva. And actually, I agree very much with what Benjamin was proposing, to understand glocalization as a program into which we could project as well other forms of unfolding culture. But what I've been trying in these last decades of practice is to think on the arts as a tool that could have a place in different stages of local dynamization. So, for example, in the beginning, when we start a process in a local context, and then there is a moment of uprisal or recognition, re-knowing, then we connect sometimes with networks, international networks, and we bring visiting artists or cultural workers from other areas, and therefore you kind of unlock sometimes local, let's say, blockages, no, that could happen just because of the internal inner communication that has been going for so long, no, in the local context. Then in the next stage, after visualizing or re-knowing what one could propose, when you are planning a project, then we try to connect with universal, let's say, values or understandings. For example, things that are actually beyond the local context. The question of regeneration in between life and death, the question of values like hospitality. So there are items, no, strength ideas that one can bring into the conversation that are like beyond just the local, let's say, meaning, no, that they could take. And then in the last stage, for example, when we visualize what has been achieved in that process of rural dynamization in a cultural sense, we work with museums and with an international network of institutions that I think it's also interesting, because it's connecting the specific localized action to broader audiences. So, for example, we were doing projects in rural areas, but then also sometimes demanding that the main art venues in urban areas should open a space to show all this.
Right, let's talk about that projects and let's dive deeper into also the projects that you are all involved in. Nancy, you are a research lead of a project called Creator, a project that aims to connect the cultural and tourism sectors to induce creative tourism in small cities and rural areas throughout Portugal. How do you connect global experiences with local communities?
Okay, thank you. Creator was, and continues on, a research and application project. So just to quickly say, it involved 5 research centers and 40 pilot organizations located in 4 regions of Portugal. And what it aimed to do was to catalyze and empower local communities to find or to identify specificities of their place that could be made into creative tourism offers to attract the global flows of travelers, or whether domestic or international. With creative tourism, just because it's not a common term, we defined it as something that was active, involved learning, involved a creation, an opportunity for the visitor and all the participants to have creative self-expression, and also involved immersion into the community. So it was something that was a step beyond someone coming to buy your work. It was something that would have to be invested in time and developed a new type of platform to connect on a more equal level between the locals and the visitors, the personification of the global, I guess, in some cases, to learn about what was special of that place by those individuals in places that in many cases didn't normally receive visitors. So it was seen as, I guess, a research action or research and application initiative to try to change the regular flows to change the usual patterns of people only visiting the large cities, and to go off into places and explore what these communities or what individuals there wish to teach, to share on their terms rather than on the visitors' terms necessarily. And then to use that as an open opportunity to develop new relationships and new connections. I'm not sure that really answered your question, but that was the nature of what we did as an experimental beginning. We know that it's inspired projects internationally, but it's also unveiled the vulnerabilities of startup organizations in rural areas. And so I'll leave that at this point. But
thank you for the insight in creative tourism and how it has an impact on global issues. As you said, it's inspiring global projects. Fernando, you work as one of your projects as a sociologist is called Inland. The project is looking to reinvent the rural and show how artists add value to local rural areas. And I know also with this project, you will be part of the upcoming documenta 15. How are global problems being received by people in the rural regions you're working in?
Well, these global problems, I was trying to define them, and very much in the same line that you did. No? They are related with how globalization is having an impact in the possible erosion of the local, no? That has a social, economical, political, and cultural effect. And the feeling then in rural areas very often is of progressive disempowerment, no? And progressive feeling of being like not in the main agenda, and becoming like something I hear in the rural areas, and especially working with people in the farming sector. That is one of the activities, no, very much connected with the rural. It's a feeling that they are like second-class citizens, no? In the sense that they don't have the same quality of services. They don't have the same access to all the what our societies, no, are producing in terms of basic services, but also culture and so on. And then this discontent, as we know, is it's triggering sometimes desired effects like falling in possible solutions or readings of the problem that can also give a new boost to authoritarian populisms in rural areas. So there is the need, no, to work with forms of re-empowering that are also like looking at questions that we see, for example, in the demographic sense, no, of the problem, the fact that, for example, environmentally speaking, no, there is a degradation on the richness of the landscapes, on the richness in an agroecological sense, no, like ecosystems that are also producing food, and they have been like industrialized, and therefore the model is pushing into a few players, no, a constant growth, then leaving many others aside. And we know that in Europe there is a very high rate, no, of closing small farms. So this abandonment of the activities, abandonment of the rural areas, and sometimes the difficulty to find a place in the other rural areas that are like actually growing as let's say second homes or areas for recreation and visiting urban populations, they are also becoming less and less accessible for those who are there. Young people who would like to be farming, land is less accessible. So this demographic problem is very much felt, and it's putting the people also in a little bit of a conflicting situation, to also understand new inhabitants. They might come from other cultural backgrounds, from other nationalities, and I think that there is like a kind of a sometimes resignation, but there is also the energy and push to try to reawake, no, and to make these places vibrant again.
Right, you mentioned
a lot of inventiveness that there was always in rural areas.
Yeah, you mentioned a couple of tensions there. Benjamin, you are a consultant to the UNESCO, holding the chair in arts and culture and education. In your opinion, where should governmental organizations and non-governmental organizations support to make a difference in rural areas concerning aspects like Fernando told us, that people don't feel second-class citizens, or the closing of small farmings? How can this organization support?
Yeah, well, there's the question of where and how and of the mode. I'd like to point out first that I think the research shows very strongly that these kind of processes really only work if they follow a participatory design, right? So this is nothing that can be done from above. For example, I like to refer very much to a wonderful book of Katrina Brown. She's a social researcher in the UK, and she wrote like 2015 or so a book entitled Resilience, Development and Global Change. And I think it's a wonderful book. It has so many examples of how resilience processes can be successful. And one of the most important parts is rootedness. And rootedness does not only mean a feeling of belonging, but actually be in charge of something, actually have agency. So, of course, following these studies, and there are many, many examples that she presents in this books and others writing about this kind of cultural resilience also, it's of utmost importance really to give the power, so to say, to the areas, and let them then, and surely not leave them alone with that, but let them develop the semantics, for example, the concepts that are important. I think also the project that Fernando is working in, the Inland project, which is part of the Documenta 15 or somehow tied to the Documenta 15. I think Documenta 15 is a huge step to make visible such kind of projects. And how they could work, and this is, I think, the most basic important thing. And then, of course, it's the how to do this. And I think for sure that well, I have a kind of bias to digitalization aspects of, but of course, digitalization is a necessary presupposition for glocalization also, in order to become visible, to be able to take part in the new global culture, in order to connect, to be seen and to show things. So infrastructure is surely one of the very important things, at least in form of a basic infrastructure. For example, in Germany, the rural areas really suffer from having a quite bad digital infrastructure. So they are quite badly connected. They could have 2 megabit lines on the countryside still in Germany, as opposed to like 50 or 100 megabits or 250 megabits per second lines in the urban areas. So that you could even not really work, for example, with YouTube and stuff like this, because it's really too slow there. Yeah, right. So this is an important thing. You can't leave the rural areas behind if you want to support them with infrastructural aspects. And then, of course, the second thing we see in our research is that it's helpful to encourage change orientation, or at least not prevent change orientation, which may be a thing. Actually, so it's not always easy for rural areas to develop, or for, let's say, institutions and local regional institutions and actors to develop their institutions and organizations, for example, because there are administrative stakeholders and rules that are not fitting these purposes. So this is a more it's not really an infrastructure thing. It's more like with which mindset do you use in order to develop rural areas. So could for example be that a local institution wants to develop something that is again connected to some online stuff, and they are too small to have an IT department, so they are reliant on the IT department of the communal region, for example. But the rules that are applied there are the rules for administration and not for cultural projects, so it doesn't fit together. So these are it's a question of mindset, and I think just to add this one point, which is what I think is really important, and all these projects that are discussed here, I think, shows is enable and organize networking between actors and institutions. Interconnect, this is, I think, the most important thing.
Right. I'd like to get back to digitization and also cultural resilience, as you mentioned. Benjamin, would you please put the title of that book on cultural resilience in the chat, because people are asking and so very much interested in that. Sticking to tension and challenges in those projects for a second. Nancy, you are involved in a second project called Uncharted, and you study values connected with culture. You state that in recent decades, culture has tended to be increasingly seen in political circles under the exclusive lens of the economy and its contribution to it. And I found that very interesting. You described the tensions in how people put arts and culture in their life. Can you explain that to us?
Okay. The project itself is a European project organized at the top by the University of Barcelona. We're one of the partners, and it was developed as you said, in response to this dominance of economic values as the only value which you could evaluate cultural products or cultural processes and activities. And it seeks to identify and make more visible alternative types of value systems and valuation processes by those involved in the cultural sector, or with cultural activities, sorry, not cultural sector, cultural activities, and primarily to look at the values that are articulated when people participate in activities, the values of the producers of cultural activities or culture products, etc., and also the values that are used by administrations and cultural and policy bodies when they evaluate and adjudicate cultural programs, and to bring those together to show how they don't quite line up, really. That we're in the middle of uncovering a diversity of values, even in one particular activity, and how different people that come to that come with completely different rationales for why they are providing, why they are there and why they're participating. And this diversity isn't always recognized, and particularly when you get to the broader level, everything is streamlined, so the diversity disappears. The long-term hope is to build a framework for making decisions around culture by policy and other actors that takes into account this broader range of values that people bring to it. I don't know if this is all very abstract, but also to recognize tensions in how people think and work on cultural activities. My team, the focus has been primarily on participation, whereas other teams have focused in some of the other areas. And we picked two projects that were really on the margins of so-called official institutionalized culture. One was creative tourism participants and elderly artisans and transfers of knowledge, of local and traditional knowledge through making activities. The other one was a community involved play in a neglected neighborhood, and I'm running out of time. Our partners in that area brought up illegal concerts during the time of COVID and other sort of self-organized activity. And we found tensions. One of the tensions, and maybe not surprises, but in most cases there were some continuities, like the social aspects of participating in cultural activities were often much more highly valued by participants than the aesthetic values of that activity or of that object. On the other hand, there was this sense that, oh, they did a good job with putting my story on stage, or and that the aesthetic, that the less institutionalized the project, the more opportunities there were for experimentation and risk-taking, On the other hand, those had smaller audiences and they couldn't influence others as much. So there was it's all of these trade-offs, but I think overall it will complexify the way that we hope policymakers will be treating culture in the future. Perhaps that will blend into, we're also interested in looking at smaller places, because we do think that a lot of the rhetorics are built from urban centers, and that there's room for other voices, and we'd like to use the project to bring those voices forward. To bring those voices forward and to get people to participate. We heard that many times today that this is a key to make a difference. Fernando, you identified the rural as a contest zone where contemporary conflicts are playing out, and you mentioned environmental sustainability, global economics versus local economics. Then today on the panel, you mentioned already food production, genetic modifications. What role can arts and culture play within all these challenges?
Yes, well, I think, again, very well aligned with what Nancy and Benjamin were saying. I think that we have to consider art more than, for example, a heritage to protect and to highlight or to put in a plinth, no? Or more than a content to bring to rural areas. Should be better considered as a process and how it's produced, how it's conducted. No? I think Jeremy Deller, the artist, was saying, art is not what you make, but what you make to happen. And in that sense, yeah, I would like to, in our processes of world dynamization, we take a lot from agroecology. I know it's a term that is not very well known, maybe in the Anglo-Saxon or Central European context, because it's coming very much from Latin schools of sociology, Paulo Freire, and other forms of activation of rural areas that were, as I said, very much developed in conjunction with the peasant movements. There is nevertheless an agroecology department in Wageningen University in the Netherlands. But well, what I mean is that in agroecology and sociology, we talk about participatory action research that is much beyond than just the researcher going to the field and capturing information. So in this case, we could be talking about the necessary participatory action creation, that is about instigating and creating the basis for a process, how that finally could end in an effective activation of a local area. It's something that is the challenge for the artist, no? Because I think that it also has to have an aesthetical quality, a poetical that transcends the everyday and the usefulness, but has to root, no, very much on the real needs and the latent vision of that local context. And that is something that we need to train artists for. We are developing now a postgraduate, we call it the Inland Academy, because we feel that what we learn in the schools is still very far from this. No? We know how to make a sculpture or a drawing, but not to really listen and to understand and to reinterpret. So we need to bring all these other skills, and whether it ends in what is sometimes called placemaking, or reenchantment, forms of new commons, it's something that comes all together, no? In a polyedric, let's say, result from this process of co-creation.
So, and also to make this academy happen, and also participation to make that happen, it's key to give everyone access to digitization. And Benjamin, you already mentioned, as you work on digitization in arts and cultural education, and this morning we heard that digitization also is one of the framework conditions. That's what also you mentioned on cultural education in rural areas. And we know, for example, in Germany, that the rural areas are left behind. As soon as you leave the urban space, you get disconnected, different than to other countries in Europe. What does that do to arts and cultural education in rural areas if that framework condition isn't met? And I think we in Germany might not be the only ones in Europe.
Yeah, sure. It doesn't make things easier. The state of things is that in arts and culture education, the digital challenge, so to say, is really a challenge independent of if you're an arts and culture educator in a city or on the countryside. So it's really not that easy to implement or to well, let's say like this. So we have this pressure of innovation in arts and culture education, like in the general education systems, towards digital innovation. So this is something that is applied, so to say, as something that everyone has to do, and it's really a top-down process, I would say, as this kind of innovation impulse, so to say. And it's really not easy for arts and culture education, because digitalization does not make sense in every aspect of the work. For example, it's really easier for some arts, for example, to implement digital aspects that in a meaningful way. That's a problem. That, of course, you can always do something online or so. But if you ask yourself, if I'm teaching, for example, arts, it's maybe it's easier in the social cultural work, but let's take really arts education in a somewhat narrow sense. Then in some arts it's easier than maybe in others. For example, in theater education, it does not make too much sense in the first place for those people, from their view, for example, to conduct digital transformations. What would, for example, mean to rethink the mediality of the theater space, of the stage, for example, and to rethink this to the stages of the global digital realm, which would mean like TikTok and stuff like this. So it's really a step, right? So it's not easy for arts and culture education anyways, I would say, for many parts at least. And then if the presuppositions are not there, the infrastructure is not there, then you wouldn't even start. So we are anyway, we see in research, we anyway see the problem that we have this kind of what I call circle of doom. Well, so there's kind of distanced relationship towards digitalization anyways. Not too much knowledge about what this all is, what it means. It's not only Facebook or not only a smartphone and not only gadget. It's really more. It's understanding digitality as an infrastructural process, as a cultural process, as a process of globalization, as something that is connected now to artificial intelligence, which will not only change our workplace but also our private lives and stuff like this. So it's really a lot, of course, to think about. And well, this is not an easy task. And I think on the countryside, if the infrastructure is not there, it's really choking the developments.
Yeah. Let's make it even more difficult and include one of the biggest challenges of our times, the COVID-19 pandemic. The changes we face in the last almost 2 years now with the global pandemic create an enormous social but also economic pressure to many rural areas. Nancy, you told us of your project of creative tourism. During the pandemic, the tourism sector came to a stop. How has the pandemic shifted how you address global and local issues in your work?
It's been a huge challenge. We know that in our project Creator, we had 40 organizations involved. We believe that all of the creative tourism type activities came to a halt during 2020. We have another associated project happening in the Azores. They're in the so-called in the middle of the development period, but now the development period has happened for 1.5 years because we haven't been able to implement anything. So the continuity has been very difficult. And of course, your own ideas change of what you want to do with your life during this experience. And so it's challenging. We had, I think, there aren't a lot of bright lights within the COVID period context, but it's been interesting to see internationally, and this ties to the previous conversation on digitization. Some creative tourism producers of activity, of workshops, how to do things, creative things, cultural things, have moved online during the COVID period and found, on one hand, they had to reinvent the whole idea of a hands-on workshop to what can be placed on someone's desk table at that end. but suddenly we're opened up to the world, and we're able to get, we know of people, there's someone in Morocco offering Islamic geometry lessons, and some people have signed up for 16 weeks. Every Saturday, that's what they do. They visit Morocco virtually, and they expand their skills. I don't think that was envisioned at all at the beginning. It's all been a huge experiment. None of our personal projects have went online, but we know that in other places, arts councils have taken the typical training programs that they would have had for their local community and put them online, and in the process found followers from the other side of the world that they didn't anticipate at all. And so there's been some interesting new connections. We also have a pilot that one of our organizations, this is it, who runs a small, it's a historic home with rooms to rent for tourists, but it also operates as a cultural center for the community. He does workshop, or visiting artists, and does workshops with the artists while they're there, all those things. Of course, all of that came to a stop. So with the extra time they gained, they launched, he's a sound artist, they launched a record label, or a recording label, which was one of those on the list of things to do someday when we aren't so busy with running the place, that they decided that's where they put their energies. So different things have appeared, but and I think, if anything, the larger tourism researchers, anyway, and professors, if not the industry as such, have rethought a lot about the relationship between tourism and the local community, and how to make that a better connection. How much of the thinking will actually roll out in practice is yet to be seen when everything's up and running.
Right. Fernando, you wrote this sentence: rurality has to be appreciated, rediscovered, looked at with another gaze. And we heard this morning also from Piotr Michałowski from Poland that a lot of urbanists escaped to the rural areas during the pandemic, especially young families were looking for more space to move, calmer gaze, and local communities. Is this part of the dynamic you wished for, or how could that appreciation for the rural areas be initiated?
Well, yes, I think we need to hear step with care in the right understanding of the terms, because to discover with a new gaze, representation sound a little bit also as territorial merchandising calls for a new wave of tourism revalorization. And although the economy from service activities as tourism are important in rural areas, shouldn't be the central, I think, activity for them. As I said, I'm coming from agricultural studies, and I think that the relation with the land, food production, is a vocation in rural areas that shouldn't be just forgotten, especially in mountain areas and areas that are not competitive in agricultural production. Although those landscapes that one could rediscover are very much based on those practices. What I mean is that we have to look at the core of what that rural culture embodies, and that's very related with those very much primary interventions in the land and with the land and ecological coexistence. There is another set of values, another form of being in the land with the others, for example, ways to manage the commons, ways to maintain breeds and biodiversity, and all that cannot be lost. And it's at the core of our rethinking of our civilization, which I think is very needed. So when I hear about the importance of digitalization, of course, it's there. We know that we cannot, maybe sometimes in many areas, talk about a distinctive rural culture. It's more of a continuum, urban-rural, and this has very much to do with the wide presence of technologies of communication. And of course, to be absent from that circulation could mean also a sort of ghettification of the countryside. But on the other hand, what I think is crucial is to have also the regeneration of other infrastructures for life. So not just the digital, but also the mediate connection and the possibility of having, as I said, a diverse mosaic of sustainable productive activities in the land and with the land. And I think that this is something that is a little bit missing in the Common Agricultural Policy or the new European Green Deal. And I think we need to see a more clear commitment and political will, for example, to intervene in markets, to have a bureaucracy that is more sensitive to the reality of small production and small scale farming. So sorry if I move out a little bit from the question, but I think that it's not so easy to look at the countryside as a sort of ideal place for escape, for retreat, or for solace from the urban situations of growing sustainability. But actually, we need to find that the citizen comes as a potential ally. No? We have seen conflicts in France of people going to the countryside and protesting about the sound of the cock in the morning or the chicken. You know, like this is happening also in Spain, and the smell of the manure of the neighbor who has cows. So sometimes we come to the countryside imposing our vision of what the pastoral idyll should be. No? And I think that this new tourism that we need has to be also educational and cultural richer than just selling a postcard and a vision, and just selling the possibility of having like a quick interaction and a selfie somewhere, but it's actually much more to understand and to become illiterate the citizens about the richness of a rural culture. As I said, goes beyond the visual and it's more embedded, embodied knowledge and appreciation. And for that, the art is also very important. And just to mention, for example, forms of rural performance, if you want, those rituals of seasonal passages, and the masks that happen in many mountain cultures are something that were successful forms of cultural expression that we need maybe now to rethink and to give back currency. But I would like to go more in that direction, that with just, let's say, digital creations and disconnection of the immediate and everyday, especially for the youth as well.
Right, and the noises of the rural, I know Nancy can think too, as she told me yesterday, she sometimes has chickens running through her office, so that needs maybe some resilience. That brings me, I know this word, brings me to cultural resilience. And Benjamin, resilience became one of the key words in the pandemic. Those who are resilient get through the pandemic or go through the pandemic more easily. Your work focuses on cultural resilience. You mentioned it. How can cultural resilience be built through arts and cultural education, and then maybe implement change globally and locally?
Yeah, let me first point out that the concept of resilience is really an ambivalent one. So I hesitated for many years to adopt this. So it was quite a process because of, well, you may know or not that resilience it's really a concept that is used in many sciences and many areas of application, and especially in the educational scientific context, it mainly comes from psychology and means individual resilience. So the property of a person, of an individual, to withstand crisis. So, and of course, this is an interesting and very fruitful concept. For example, asking for resilience building in schools, where it focuses on the single subject, so to say, a single individual. And this is okay, but what maybe it's okay. The problem is the more resilient the population is, the more pressure you can put on it while keeping the system running. So this is always this neoliberal trap of resilience, right? And what I've learned to seek or to understand as resilience has a lot to do really with learning that we should really switch to think about collective processes, much more than only individual educational processes. So resilience has a lot, in the end, has a lot to do with a learning collective, so to say. It does not only have to be a collective of humans, by the way, but can really be a social material collective of things that grows together and changes in a way that is bottom up, so to say, that is connected, towards to meaning making. Just like Fernando mentioned, these rituals on the countryside, the intangible cultural heritage, for example. So if we ask what is that, so in recent years UNESCO of course strengthened and made visible the meaning of the intangible cultural heritage, and there's a lot of these halfway forgotten rituals on the countryside. So this connects our bodies to a meaning that is kind of cosmological or planetary, that connects us to. We don't have to know this cognitively, but it connects us to the ways that things are interacting and adjusting, so to say, more generally speaking, to what the processes of lives are really. So and this is, of course, we don't understand this if we just see some ritual, but it comes from this. So there's a historicity in that, and there's a knowledge and values encapsulated in that may be forgotten still if the ritual is still there. We maybe we are not able to decode this, but so this is where it grows, and of course it underlies change. For example, like gender regulations and rituals, or so we surely. We would have to rethink this. But anyway, things like this interconnect collectives and represent learning processes or enable learning processes on a collective basis. And I think this is the interesting thing about this concept of resilience. And if we ask how this would connect to arts and cultural education, well, then I would think that at least in my view, for my way of thinking about this, there's a certain aspect of resistance that should be tied to resilience, but not in the way of the traditional enlightenment way of critique. So there's a subject on this side of the world, and it criticizes this part of the world, which is the extended world. It's more like an attitude of critical engagement that builds up structures, for example. So it's this is something that withstands, so to say, certain processes of change, and that, for example, maybe it's a bit complex, but it is like this, I would say. So say you take some local ritual that could really appear to be a conservative thing. And then you have a globalization process top down, so to say. And these little things withstand this kind of new values that are applied from above, in that case, through globalization, for example. So it leaves a core of a different kind of meaning that is not implied in the global policy of how things should rationally be seen and worked and stuff like this. That could be, for example, taking the Documenta 15 thing or the inland project. That could be, for example, Monsanto, or the way that we think about soil and do and work with the soil that we have, for example. So this is rationalized, and then on the other hand, you have this traditional ecological knowledge, for example, which is encapsulated in rituals and embodied in rituals, and it's bodily knowledge, and it doesn't fit together. So there's this aspect of resistance there, and this is interesting because I think this really prevents from having this kind of globalized monoculture. It's a multiplicity and a diversity of embodied knowledges, which I think it's really very valuable. And this is part of resilience building processes, I would say, to be able to strengthen this. And arts and cultural education, I think, have to work on the modes of perception towards what is normalized, the normalized policies of our perceptions in a globalized world. This is, I think, where arts and cultural education really steps into and enables changing the normalized way of seeing things, of seeing the countryside, like just like Nancy and Fernando are saying, of seeing. So what do I see if I travel? It's like a picture for me. Everything is like a postcard. It's the normalized way of seeing things, and as opposed to experience the difference. And if you really experience the difference, then it goes through your body, for example. You eat things that you maybe don't want to eat. You experience heat that you don't want to experience. Everything is changing from within. And then you have to ask, how could people how do people do this? How do they live here? You have to then learn through your body. Well, and I think, hopefully, I made myself clear. So
Yes,
this is how, yeah.
Thank you. Very interesting. And now in the first part of this panel discussion, we discussed the term glocalization, and the second we added the challenges of the pandemic. And now on the last few minutes we have, I'd like to add another major transformational process, the climate crisis, which has also major impacts on rural areas. As you mentioned, the heat in some countries, they become heat waves, and the climate change, floods, forest fires, all that we know of. It endangers our nutrition, etc., etc. Fernando, you are preparing your PhD on agroecology, as you said, and last week I know you've been in the UK for the UN Climate Change Conference, COP26. Which climate challenges have you encountered in your work and in rural areas, and what is most needed there concerning arts and cultural education?
Yes, well, I think that climate change or climate crisis is one of the ways in which the ecological collapse that we see coming is manifesting. And we should also look at the multidimensional aspect of this crisis, in the sense that what we see is as well as degradation of ecosystems, loss of biodiversity, waste accumulation, and toxic waste, in different forms, plastics and so on. So all these effects of the ecological crisis are present in the countryside, sometimes in a more perceptible way than climate crisis or climate change, because that also varies very much from one region to the other. In general, if you ask an old shepherd, an old woman in my village, what they think about the environment they have seen. Well, it was funny because once a shepherd answered me, nature, there was nothing of that back in my days. So this is what it was referring, is that the discourse of nature, something divided from culture, is also came with the perception of the ecological crisis. But what we see, as I said, is like the decay in the presence of insects, of birds. There's a huge loss on small birds in Europe. The farming areas that are being industrialized became monocultures, as Benjamin was referring before, with very little resilience. Actually, it is a term we use in agroecology, the capacity to recover from environmental turbulence also can be provoked by weather, and unpredicted collapse or effect. And I think that people who are working with the land are seeing this more and more. Like the soils are losing fertility, that microbiome of the soil is being simplified, requiring of more inputs, but also in the alpine regions, the grazing season is being shorter. The water reservoirs are also a little bit more compromised. There is in general, of course, a progressive warming, with these effects and turbulences, as we saw with the floods, or I don't know, in Spain we had a major snowstorm last February. So things that wouldn't be expected can alter very much the natural cycles of the crops, fruit trees, and unless there is no clear way to respond to this, apart from, for example, going back to seed varieties that are more adaptable than the industrial one, and the hybrids. The same for breeds of animals that are more responsive to changes in the environment. And other effects that we could see in rural areas are maybe not so directly related on how the weather will change in that specific area, but also more globally, thinking, for example, on the rise of climate refugees, that we might see happening more and more, or climate-related conflicts. Even the war in Syria was maybe related. So yes, I think this is very perceptible, and I think that the question of how that would concern with art and cultural education. It's maybe a longer question to answer now.
Yeah, I think what you mentioned, Nancy, can very well link to as a climate change and the raising awareness that comes with it. Also change the way we think of tourism, right? Flying, of traveling, and as your project, as you said, makes people come to rural areas where they usually wouldn't go. How does climate change changes the way we think of cultural education in rural areas, or tourism as a local project in rural areas?
I guess thinking of it in two ways. One was a conversation I had last week with a young tourism entrepreneur who usually works in Colombia but is now in Italy, and we talked about there's been a trend recently about transformational travel, that people were seeking something to change their mindset, to restart their life before COVID. And now her perspective was, at this point, if your travel is not transformative, then why are you doing it? At least for her it was basically, why would you get on a plane and travel to go somewhere else unless it's going to be transformative in some way? And I think that links to something that we're trying to advocate for and define more fully, which is, to add one more term to the discussion, regeneration or regenerative. For us, it's regenerative tourism. The idea, which is regenerative, has come up as a buzzword since about March last year, or 2020, as you can probably expect why. What we've seen is it coming up as another buzzword, but what we're looking at it from the perspective of our creative tourism initiatives, which are small scale in nature. It's about going beyond sustainable tourism, which is also a buzzword, which is kind of like do no harm, to something that you intentionally are trying to improve the place you are visiting as well as yourself in the process. And I think there's a lot to be done and still developed that can combine travel, making or doing, and learning together to re-educate ourselves on all of the sort of things that Fernando just said, the real knowledge of place and cycles and disturbances of cycles, and all of the embodied knowledge that our society and particularly urban societies have kind of lost. One of the other areas of research or teaching that I do is around cultural sustainability, and it's been defined in many ways. And one of the perspectives was about how we need to build a new culture on the earth to live more within the limits of the earth, as well as with each other. And I think the climate crisis or climate emergency has really upped the stakes of how important that is, and to really re-envision everything we do from that perspective. And one of the things I've noticed with creative tourism, and we are in an incremental sort of learning mode, although it is international as an area, it's sometimes thought as an activity which enables one to share one's culture, one's knowledge, but as a, I don't know, in a little, like as a, not necessarily a pastime, but it's a vacation thing you do. And I think we should rethink what kind of knowledge can be transformed, can be relayed and shared in the process of making something together or learning together. And that, I know we had one pilot that used, it was an environmental organization that wanted to get involved in creative tourism, created workshops using traditional weaving techniques to teach people how to build birdhouses, at that point nesting for birds in an area that needed this sort of thing. It was a small little piece, and when you think of climate crisis, it's a little small piece, but it was kind of on the right path. And to make these objects, you are together for 2 hours or 3 hours. So during that time, people can tell you about their knowledge, show you, compare practices across cultures, deepen the learning that can happen. And I think the idea of these lenses that we bring when we go to the countryside from a city environment can be quite, well, it'd be good to shatter them a little bit. And I think, but there's a lot of people who are out there eager to learn how to do things themselves, how to be more resilient, or to be not damaging the earth as they live. And so I think there's there's an opening there to develop things that could kind of start in the small ways to address that need to re-educate ourselves.
Okay, now as I look on the time, time's flying. I could go on and on with you talking. I do have a last question for the three of you, please, with a very brief answer. So if the pandemic taught us one thing, then that we better don't make too far away plans for the future. But nevertheless, in a 5 years' time, where do you hope we are with arts and cultural education in rural areas? Very, very brief answer, please. Benjamin, do you want to start?
Well, hopefully we would be in a better place, of course, but it's really regarding, I have to say, regarding we didn't talk about the huge differences of the structures in the rural areas. They are so different that the aims and goals have to be different ones for the areas. But I would very much hope that we would be a step towards this kind of glocalization we talked about in the beginning. This is what I would hope, that the rural areas discover the power of making itself visible, being seen and defining itself. So this is, I think, something that maybe is possible and could be supported by arts and cultural education also.
Right, thank you. Fernando?
Yes, it's difficult to make these prospections and forecasts, but I think that first maybe shouldn't be differentiated from culture in general. Shouldn't be like rural culture as opposed to other forms of culture as they appear in rural spaces. So I would say that there is a more cohesive and homogeneous understanding of how art and culture happens in society, that is aligned with the need of radical change in our patterns of how our societies unfold their powers and capacities, not just anymore in a technical industrial way, or a continuous expansion in the manipulation of natural resources, but also in forms of more fulfillment and harmony with the everyday and creative becoming like part of neighborhood activity, and that happenings in at different levels, both new understanding of the cities, new understanding of the countryside, and with rural areas much more vibrant and alive for sure, and with better education for artists, as I mentioned before.
Thank you, Fernando. And Nancy, what are your brief hopes?
Brief hopes, I guess. The first one that came to mind would be that arts and cultural education and arts and cultural practices, and a little bit more general, really are rooted to the place where they are, and that there's a sense of pride and knowledge transmission through generations of the embodied knowledges and skills that exist in these places, in every place, that often we look to the external place to build up someone who's far away in New York or whatever, but that the local practices are neglected. And I think the rootedness and empowerment locally is one. I think two more. Then one is second is that I hope that artistic research processes or artistic modes of inquiry and expression are recognized as valid ways of knowing one's world and learning and developing oneself, and that it becomes more widespread so that it's not just art projects on the side after school, and that in the same way of learning through art practices, that communities and learners, lifelong learners, are open to finding the connections internationally that link them to others on the earth.
Thank you, Nancy. And to create such space, I share your hopes, and to create all that that cannot last without the permanent efforts of researchers and practitioners as you are. Thank you so much to the panelists. Thank you, Nancy. Thank you, Fernando. And thank you, Benjamin, for being here with us today. And we can share some virtual applause reactions. There's this applause we can share. Thank you. And now we have a couple of minutes left, and I'd like to ask Julia Effinger, who organized this wonderful conference with such a great spirit for the course, and she put into this conference everything that is important: professionalism and attention to detail, had everything in view, the chapter participants, me and you. Also some virtual applause to you, Julia, and please give us your concluding remarks to that conference.
Thank you very much, dear Eva. Wow, such a rich discussion. Thank you very much for the final panel discussion. And I'm pleased to be able to say a few words shortly before the end, as well as I'm pleased about the great participation and interest in this conference. Just shortly, let's review the day. We got to know and discuss different facts and levels of arts and cultural education in rural areas and the research on it. We got to know the funding program of the German Federal Ministry of Education and Research. We talked about transformations. In the working groups moderated and wonderfully designed by researchers from the funding program and 2 European projects, we spoke about possibilities of theater work for cosmopolitan perspectives, about new goals of artistic residences, about the potential of music for school development and the relevance of libraries and the digital transformation. But we also got to know topics like cultural education and its influence on affects, belonging, and the structures of cultural adult education, cultural industry, sustainability, as well as community building. The final panel also took up these terms and discussed the central challenges of globalization. I will not repeat what was so interesting right now, but in each case, there were conversations with positions from different countries on horizons we have discussed across borders. This is still and today again of immense importance. But not only across national borders, also across borders of disciplines, fields of study, and the borders between research and practice, and thus hopefully contributed to a transfer. And in conclusion, I would like to say, we have been talking all day about culture and arts education, about the power of the arts and their potential and their societal impact, especially in rural areas. I would like to finish with a quote of the German sociologist Andreas Willisch, who researches on rural areas. He makes an analogy with water diviners, who are people who can sense underground water currents with their instruments. So artists in rural areas are the water diviners who recognize open, free spaces that others don't see or don't want to see. Thank you, dear speakers and active collaborators, for your exciting and engaging contribution. And thanks to you, dear participants, for your interest. It is very central to me that the last voice in this event will be an artistic voice. I'm very much looking forward to the poetic closing and give back to our wonderful moderator, Eva Lindner.
Thank you, Julia. And I'm also super excited to introduce you now to Joelle Taylor, who gives us the poetic closing. And she's an award-winning poet and spoken word artist from the UK. And on her website, I found this wonderful quote that describes her even better than I could. So I will quote that for you. Joelle Taylor is a shapeshifter, a myth maker, linguistic risk taker, poetical activist, surrealist with a raised fist. Joelle, the stage is yours.
Thank you so much, Eva, and thank you to all of you for allowing me to come and witness some of your discussions today. It's been an extraordinary day. As somebody said, the rich seams of conversation for mining have really been extraordinary. Now, as you can hear, I'm struggling quite a lot with a sore throat. So what I decided to do is share the screen and also read, just so you get a sense of the rhythm. one of the major things, and you'll find as I'm going through this, you might recognize something that you've particularly said, or in one case, something you've got on your wall, because you've let me into your houses and I've been looking at your books and your furniture and your artwork too. So this is called deep listening. 1. A story migrates from the city, suitcase stuffed with cathedrals of pixels, live streams pouring from pockets. At the end of the world, we are borderless, reborn, we are present, deep listening, the algorithms of connection readjusting, to be seen, to perform ourselves, our fall, caught by an internet balanced between the branches of an old tree, while behind us, cities burst into multiple centres, almost a virus in the conversation between concrete and sky. And now, we are hybrid. Part kitchen table, part iPhone application, each of us a bright stone in a rapidly evolving mosaic, spreading between nations. We eat together. In the center of the table, under a silver dome, an idea. We eat history and pass language between us, rules, ritual and relations, the feast of affinity, of wide inclusivity. 2. Paint migrates from the canvas and coalesces into poetry that communes in books that learn to dance and remember your name. We watch the cartoon flick of decorated bus stops, an organic film curated by children, call it the Museum of Belonging. We see the Amdram group drunk on philosophy upstairs at the village pub. We see the post officer who paints in the quiet light. We see the children whose arms grow into guitars, all the back bedroom operators, the social media intelligentsia. We see the library throwing open its arms, the workers at the coalface of the page, hacking words out of white. We see the dancers at the edge of ideas. Know this. Collectivity is the antidote to cultural fascism, and we are animals of value, scrubbing the ground for new narratives, crossing the chasm between audience and performer, concrete and country, balancing on thin strands of web. Understanding both branches are essential for keeping the thread tight, knowing a bridge moves 2 ways. The more we define art, the less it understands itself. Deep listening. Let the hills tell you what they saw. Let the ground remind you of the story of the boot. Let trees be our libraries, the archives of the forest. Let rock fall, echo, dust. Let art interrupt us. If we throw words into lakes, let us be alive to the meaning of ripples. Let the ripples go where they need to. You cannot tell the waves to go home, so open your theatres to water, your workshops and festivals, your nurseries, your schools. Open your homes to the ocean. Let the waves flood the library and carry the books into the streets. And we are throwing the stone now in this quiet corner of here, while digital trees fruit faces that bursts into seeds and pollinate policies. An old thinker finds their face at last, pinned between the pages of a new handshake. Thank you. I hope you had a good squeaking version of my voice there.
Thank you so much,
grazie.
Joelle.
Thank you very much.
Really, thank you so much. This virtual applause is for you. Give some applause to Joelle. Thank you so much for the poetic reflection on our conference, and we could hear your voice suffering. We appreciate it a lot. And now the last words on today's conference I leave to Angela Eder, Executive Board Member of the Genshagen Foundation. It was a great pleasure for me being your moderator today, and WonderMe will be open until 5 today, so you can keep on networking, and the team might post a link in the chat again for you. Thank you for being here with us today, taking so actively part in this conference, and I say bye, have a great weekend, and I leave the stage to Angela Eder, who I know prayed for the internet goddesses this morning. What do you say?
Yes, well, thank you, Eva Lindner, and thank you, Joel, and thank you, Julia Effinger, and all the others, all the speakers, participants. It was great to listen to you, to watch you, the exchange, and Julia Effinger summarized it already, and after Joel Taylor's wonderful poem, I don't want to say much more. I hope, well, there will be outcome of this, that there are more links between you internationally in Europe and beyond, that you have found new contacts, new inspiration, which are fruitful for your work, and maybe some new cooperations will come out of this. For us in Genshagen, the topic of the role of art and cultural education in rural areas will remain one of the key topics, and it was so interesting to listen to you, because, for example, what should cultural policy do in our countries to support this in the future? And of course, it's also a question of democracy of values, how we deal with the topic homeland and the regional connections. So thank you all. Thank you especially Eva Lindner. Thank you Julia Effinger and all the others. Thank you Nina Kolek and colleagues. You were the starting point with this meta project. Thank you Markus Breik and the Federal Ministry of Education and Research. And we stay in touch. Hope you will all manage to get through the next probably a bit difficult weeks, at least in Germany. And we're looking forward to meet you either online or in the real life. All the best to all of you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Goodbye, everybody.